Well, following the Quebec government's adoption of Bill 21, officially entitled an act respecting the laicity of the state. Laicity is not a real English word. That's an error in the translation, I consider it, but it doesn't matter. The controversy surrounding the bill raged on in Quebec media, but in Canada outside Quebec, there was little or no controversy because the overwhelming majority of Canadian media agreed that Bill 20 was, in their view, a horrible attack on fundamental freedoms and a proof of a serious aberration and extreme xenophobia affecting Quebec and those who support the law. Meanwhile, among the various Anglo-Canadian humanist and atheist groups that declare themselves secular, none supported Bill 21. Worse still, at least 3 of these associations explicitly oppose it, and at least one has declared its intention to intervene before the Supreme Court of Canada against the bill if the court challenge reaches that high, which it probably will. Yet, Bill 21, although it is modest, it's an important step towards secularism. Anyone who opposes it is taking a position which is outright anti-secular. And if we define secularism by 4 basic principles, first of all, protection of the freedom of conscience of the citizenry. Secondly, equality of citizens, both women and men. 3, state religious neutrality. And 4, separation between religions and state. Then it's obvious that a state official in a position of authority who wears a religious symbol, as prohibited by Bill 21, violates at least the separation principle. You can see this if you consider a police officer or a judge who's wearing a hijab or a visible crucifix while on the job, then clearly there's a violation of separation. And it also violates the other 3 principles as well. I mentioned the separation principle because it's the most important of the 4. There are those who say that I'm going too far if I apply this judgment to the Anglophone groups and saying they're anti-secular, because they have learned a different definition of secularism, Lockean secularism instead of Republican secularism, Lockean based on the writings of John Locke. Such critics might protest that for Anglophones, religion is part of the intimate identity of the person, and therefore one cannot ask the believer who wears such an identity symbol to remove it to go to work. Are Anglophones congenitally incapable of understanding that a religious belief is not qualitatively different from a political opinion or a non-religious philosophical conviction? Now, I'm well aware that the distinction between the 2 models, the Lockean secularism, which I would call pseudo-secularism in the English-speaking world, and Republican secularism in the French. The pseudo-secularism purports to protect freedom of religion, but it often neglects the separation principle. Republican secularism, on the other hand, protects freedom of conscience, which includes both freedom of and freedom from religion. By the way, I use the expression Republican secularism to translate laïcité, to be clear about what form of secularism I'm talking about. Despite the difference between the 2 models, the concept of religion-state separation is nevertheless very well known in English, especially given that Thomas Jefferson famously promoted it, even if it is rarely fully respected in practice. Furthermore, freedom from religion is a well-known concept in English as well. One of the most important American secular organizations is called the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Finally, if I can understand Republican secularism, then other Anglophones can make a little effort in that direction. The difference between the 2 models may explain the enormous delay of English-Canadian groups in terms of secularism, but does not justify it. It's not enough to understand the difference between the 2 models. We must educate the public to understand the necessity and the advantages of Republican secularism. Here I'm using Bill 21 as a sort of a litmus test of support for secularism. The law, despite its modesty, is so avant-garde in the North American context, and the reaction of anti-secularists to it is so dishonest, fanatical, and hysterical that a position for or against this law constitutes a decisive criterion. However, it's not the only issue that matters, of course. Secularists or pseudo-secularists in Canada face other important challenges. Number 1, Parliamentary Motion M103, which condemns so-called Islamophobia and associates it with racism. The loaded term Islamophobia poses several problems. First of all, a phobia is an irrational fear, but there's nothing irrational about fearing a religion. especially a fundamentalist variant. The term conflates an ideology, Islam, with a set of people, Muslims. If the word Islamophobia is used to criticize anti-Muslim prejudice, then it's confusing an idea with people, or with a group of people. And finally, since the accusation is often used in conjunction with accusations of racism, then it's a conflation between religious affiliation and racial identity, which, anyway, secularists must oppose M103. Number two, we have to recognize the constitutional weakness of secularism in the United States. The Constitution of that country respects neither the separation principle nor the concept of freedom from religion. And you just have to look at the First Amendment to the Constitution to see that. We have to recognize also the highly political nature of religious symbols, especially the Islamic veil. To consider them mere clothing or wearing them to be a purely personal choice is wanton ignorance. A religious symbol has an objective ideological meaning independent of the mentality of the person wearing it. It must be noted that Islamists exploit the so-called anti-racist movement in order to fight against secularism. This is mostly done by promoting confusion between race and religion, as I've mentioned. And we see this in the specious association of Islamophobia with racism. And finally, it must be recognized that anti-Quebecois prejudice is an important aspect of the opposition to secularism in English Canada. This prejudice is exploited by opponents of Bill 21 in order to demonize the law and denigrate the majority of Quebecers who support it. Now, on each of these crucial issues, to the best of my knowledge, so-called secular organizations in English Canada have been either silent or else they have rallied to an anti-secular position. They have failed miserably. And yet, less than a decade ago, when the Parti Québécois government proposed its charter of secularism in 2013 and was defeated in 2014, three such organizations, including Humanist Canada, took a position sympathetic to the charter, partially sympathetic at least. What has changed since? Why is there currently no total lack of support from Anglo-Canadian organizations? I think the explanation is obvious. For several years, a movement commonly known as wokeism has gained a lot of influence in the media, among politicians, as well as in a large number of activist organizations, including ostensible secularists. But we need a better definition of this phenomenon because the term wokeism is far too vague. It's a movement whose theoretical foundations include several tendencies, but two stand out. Postmodernism applied to political activism and a sort of orphaned and lobotomized post-Marxism resulting from the definitive end of the Soviet era. I call this movement the anti-Enlightenment pseudo-left, or more succinctly, the post-left, as its essential characteristic is the rejection of the values of the Enlightenment, values which are at the origin of the very definition of the political left. Today, these values are widely accepted, or at least were before the advent of the post-left. Even the moderate right adheres to them. Thus, adherents of this movement, despite their claim to be on the left, are to be to the right of the moderate right on some issues, such as secularism and freedom of expression, for example. The post-left is fundamentally anti-secular for several reasons. Firstly, secularism, like modernity, objectivity, reason, and science, is a key product of the Enlightenment, which the post-left rejects. Secondly, because of its postmodernist leanings, the post-left veers into cultural relativism, as if every tradition, every religion had its own truth that cannot be criticized. Excluding religions from the state therefore becomes unacceptable, for by what right can one choose one truth over another? Especially given that this religious truth constitutes the believer's intimate identity, which must be protected in the name of minority rights. The damage done by the post-left is extensive and well-known. Some examples: the censorship of the title Nègre Blanc d'Amérique of the book by Pierre Vallière, the exclusion from certain university positions of candidates with an insufficient number of intersectional points, the cancellation of the Place Slave, government grants to certain Islamic, or maybe it should be called Islamist, certain Islamic organization to promote the wearing of the hijab and to fight against so-called Islamophobia. The list is long. Now I want to concentrate on one particular example of damage done by the influence of the post-left. In November and December of 2020 rather, I attended almost all the sessions of the Quebec Superior Court, where several individuals and organizations were contesting Bill 21. And day after day, a theme emerged from the strategy of these opponents: post-left ideology. The argumentation against Bill 21 was an orgy of post-leftist dogma, with repeated use of themes such as racism, obsession with personal and minority identities, rhetoric of inversion, that is, rebranding privileges as rights, as if they were rights, the denigration of people of European descent, and anti-Quebecois prejudice. Several lawyers claimed that the purpose of Bill 21 was to promote not only discrimination against women and certain religious minorities, but even worse, to foment genocide of those minorities. And yet Bill 21 excludes no one and targets no identifiable group. Rather, it simply excludes certain behavior, wearing religious symbols from a specific context on the job. The adversaries of the law denied any suggestion that religious symbols might have any negative effect whatsoever on anyone else, even on school children, as if such symbols were completely innocuous and innocent in all contexts. They totally rejected any attempt to determine the objective meaning of such symbols, including the obviously misogynistic Islamic full veil, such as the niqab, and recognized only the subjective meaning expressed by the wearer of the symbol. One lawyer compared Bill 21 to the oath of allegiance to the British monarch, which prior to 1774 forced candidates for state employment to renounce the Catholic faith. However, Bill 21 does nothing of the sort. It affects only religious expression, not belief, and only in the workplace. Lawyers against Bill 21 tried repeatedly to draw an equivalence between religious minorities on one hand and minorities of other types, such as racial minorities, gays, the disabled, and so on. The testimonies of several expert witnesses opposing the law were almost entirely dedicated to this false parallel, this confusion between the changeable and the inalterable. One expert admitted during his testimony that he makes no distinction and does not even understand the distinction between religious identity and other types of identity. The testimony of one expert dealt only with religious minorities, especially Afro-Americans in the United States. One lawyer declared that all conclusions based on race can be applied to religious affiliation, thus evacuating the concept of freedom of conscience. The prize for maximum wokeitude goes to Maître Azim Hussein, who compared the law to racist rules in the USA, which required all blacks to sit at the back of the bus, and to the internment of Japanese Canadians in concentration camps in World War II. He even made the outrageous comparison of Bill 21 with the Nazis' Nuremberg laws, as if Bill 21 could be genocidal. In his determination to discredit two experts who testified in support of Bill 21, he referred to one as an older white male heterosexual and to the other as a white man. Surely in a court of law, such ad hominem impertinence should not be tolerated. Yet in both cases, the judge did not intervene. And a year later, this same Hussein was appointed to the bench of Quebec Superior Court. In summary, the opponents of Bill 21 systematically sowed confusion by essentializing religious affiliation and ignoring freedom of conscience, thus completely disregarding a major aspect of secularism. So what can be done in the face of such excesses, such folly? In my opinion, there are two main lines of action. Firstly, we must engage in public education in secularism, both in Quebec and in English Canada. The Rassemblement pour la Laïcité, a coalition of Quebec secular groups, plans to produce a series of educational video capsules about secularism. As for promoting secularism in the rest of Canada, the book Stillbirth is my modest contribution to such a project. And secondly, we must counter the ravages of the post-left by attacking its philosophical underpinnings. That is, we must defend and promote enlightenment values such as universalism, objectivity, reason, science, and secularism, while exposing cultural relativism and post-leftist dogmatism. In my opinion, the post-left constitutes a para-religion, while other observers could consider it to be a religion, even in the literal sense of the word, but whatever. Either way, I fear that post-leftism may be overtaking Christianity and Islam as the obscurantist religious movement that poses the most serious threat to secularism, and it's allied with Islamism. Thank you for your patience.